Um, Here we're talking about Dead On TV show episode 15. This is a lawyer advertisement. Nothing here should be taken as legal advice. And I think on this segment, we might say we're actually kind of going more into performance art. And so we're going to talk about I've got Rodney Meyer here, an attorney, and I'm Mark Milikowski, attorney, and we're going to be talking about the sovereign state. Rodney, is that the right way of talking about it?
Sovereign citizens,
The
or
sovereign citizens.
we
Okay,
can also call them sovcits.
soft sits. Okay, why don't you give us a rundown on this? This is kind of something that's, I guess, blowing up YouTube, and a lot of people are coming up with this legal theory. From what I've seen, it's a little shaky when you get to court. But what do we got here, Rodney?
Well, it's definitely shaky when you get to court, but there's a lot of interest right now, especially on YouTube. A lot of people are posting videos of people that are attempting these theories in court or on the public square, and with some not so good results, such as being tased and being arrested, and or upsetting the judge to the point where you're not only lose your case, but sometimes your freedom. But it's interesting theory here. One of them is that there's two classes of citizens here now in America. Now, we don't endorse these particular theories, but there's the original or sovereign citizen, which are the only ones that actually have a right, or the rights under the Constitution as enumerated in the Constitution. And then they believe there's the federal citizens, who are people that were post 14th Amendment. So 1865, when we
okay, so they would be the sovereign citizen protagonists, or the sovereign citizen people who are for that. Okay, and so correct. They believe that in 1865 there was the 14th Amendment, and at that point a lot of people didn't consent to be ruled by the federal government. Is that kind of the idea?
Right. So as you know, we were just getting out of the Civil War. Reconstruction was happening, and so obviously the losing Confederate side, the North came in, and they called them carpetbaggers, among other things, where the Northerners were coming in and basically took over the ruling of and the government for the Southern states, or the Confederacy, or what used to be the Confederacy. And so their point is, well, the people in the Confederacy did not elect these people. These were Northerners that came in. And so it's not a proper government, because they were not employed by the people, right? So they weren't elected. They weren't elected, right?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting because the Civil War is, the North calls it the Civil War, the South calls it the War of Northern Aggression. And if you look kind of what happened there, the South was paying 2/3 of the taxes, right? And the North was paying 1/3, and there was more people in the North, and the South was going like, I'm paying all these, I'm paying taxes for 10 Northerners. That's not such a great deal, right? And so this was more and then they voted to secede, and they did everything according to the Constitution. They did everything legal. There's nothing the Southern states did that was illegal. They voted under the Constitution how you secede. And then the Northerners said, look, well, who's going to pay all our taxes? You know, these guys, we've been riding these guys for a long time. So we're not going to let them get away with that. And so then there was the Fort Sumter, and this all blew up. And then they said, well, it was something about slavery, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at the Rothschilds and the Asiento and the Aaron Lopez cartels from the 1500s, basically the Khazarian mafia, they captured 110 million black slaves in Africa. Now, the majority of those, probably about 105 million, went to Brazil. And out of those, about 20 million died, 5 million in forced marches in Africa, 5 million in Brazil, and about 12 million on ships being raped and beaten by the Khazarian mafia, because, you know, they didn't treat them very well, and they're crammed together. And if somebody got sick, you got thrown overboard, right? And those, because they didn't want to contaminate people. And also, if you rape someone to death, that wasn't good for morale, and beat them to death. So they throw them overboard. But that's all documented, because they cut the ears off 12 million black slaves and put that in the ship's logs. And you can go to Nantucket or wherever the big slave, where the money ended up. The Hampshires, that's kind of where the Hampshires got their money, was the slave trade. But none of those were white Christian slave traders, right? And if you come to United States, about 2% or 3%, so about 5% of the total black slaves made it to America. And only about 5% of those slaves were owned by white Christians. They're mostly owned by the Khazarian mafia, who are the ones that were the financiers for the I guess War of Northern, or the Civil War for both sides. Anyway, so there's a lot of dispute over this, what to call the Civil War. Okay, go ahead, keep going on this thing.
Exactly. So afterwards, in the 1930s, we really got off of, well, we started in 1913 to get off of the gold standard. So now there's this theory that the government is using U.S. citizens. These would be the federal citizens, according to the sovereign citizens.
After 1865.
No, this would be after 1913, and when
Okay.
we started getting off the gold standard. That now they're using them as collateral for the debt. So there's supposed to be this super top secret account that is with the U.S. Treasury. So every time somebody's born in America, they put somewhere around $600,000 in this super top secret account. The only way you can access this is by filing some UCC claims. And this is why the UCC one especially is so popular with the sovereign citizen movement, is because they believe that by filing these claims under the UCC code, that you can somewhat access this super top secret account and to drain the money and to drain the account. Of course, nobody's ever been able to find this account, and you can file as many UCC claims as you want, and that account doesn't exist.
Okay, so isn't there something about how your name is spelled and whether judges in the United States have authority? Give us a little rundown on that.
So if you look at most court dockets, the defendant's name and something plaintiff's name in civil cases, in criminal cases not, but in civil cases, the claim for, or the name of both parties is written in all capital. And so they argue that if your name is written in all capital letters, then it's the corporation, because there's two entities that are created at birth. One is your corporate name, or your legal government name, which is your name actually spelled in all capital letters. And then there's your birth given name, which is your name spelled with the first letter of each word or
so
name.
The one that's in all caps
capital
is this kind of a fake federal thing that doesn't have authority. Is that what they're saying?
Right. So they only the federal government has authority over it. So if you go to court, their theory is, if you go to court and you say, I am not, it's called a straw man, right? So your legal corporate entity is a straw man. So if you're the agent for that straw person, then you don't have to. The corporate doesn't have jurisdiction over the human. They have only jurisdiction over the person, over the corporation. And so they try to make this separation. And so they'll answer, if the court says, is this your true, John Doe, is this your legal name? They'll say, no, I am the agent. I'm not John Doe. I am the agent for John Doe, which doesn't quite work legally, obviously, because whether you're the agent of the person, you're still, and you can't represent somebody unless you're an attorney, which is interesting because they say that attorneys don't really function correctly here, because we call ourselves Esquire many times. And since Esquire comes from the British system, they believe that the Constitution does not allow for British royalty titles, because Esquire came from, it was a sign of nobility. And so they believe that because Esquire comes from nobility and it's been banned in America, we don't have nobility titles, that those of us that are members of the bar, whatever bar that happens to be, and you and I are California bar, we're not legally, or we don't follow the Constitution, because the Constitution does not have nobility titles, and we use nobility titles in our everyday practice.
Yeah, and I think also they attack the authority of the judges as well, and I'm not sure what the argument is on that, but I guess they're saying you're a representative of this fake federal government.
Exactly.
And I mean, I think they have some theoretical claims, but none of those I think are going to have much chance in court. I mean, if you look back to 1913, which I think a lot of times that's when they put the IRS in, and of course there was 5 different amendments, right, that were got to for the tax law, right, and to say income tax. But that's like, that's like having 5 different sales contracts for your house. There was no contract, right? But it was passed on Christmas Eve, and I think a few people were assassinated, and it was kind of done how you do that, push through, and then some people end up, whatever, committing suicide and that kind of thing. So that's how and they also put the FBI through, which in the same way, that was, no one knows what the authority is on that. And then the Federal Reserve popped in, where a bunch of, I guess, London bakers, basically, Khazarians, of course, they took a loan from $20 million from the federal government, and then they loaned it back at, basically, they loan it back at whatever, 300% interest. And they've been doing that ever since. Like this flim flam deal that no one really can explain. Fractional banking. What fractional banking is, like, if I'm a bank, I can, and I have $10, I can lend out 100, right? 10 to 1. Right. And so if I lend out $100 and I lose it, well, I don't have to pay it. Then you go to the taxpayers and they have to pay the Federal Reserve. So it's kind of like heads I win, tails you lose. And also when you look at it, let's say there's usury is 10%, but a lot of people pay 28% on their credit cards, right? Now, if you can do 10 of those, that's 280%. Okay, and so the basically the London bakers, the Khazari mafia, who have nothing to, the Federal Reserve has nothing to do with the United States of America, nothing. I mean, they aren't the government. They have nothing to do with it. They're not federal and they have no reserves, right? But that's just kind of a name, like the new Coca-Cola or something like that. But so they give you 1% or 0.5% at your bank when you put your money in. They take that money and they loan it out at almost 300%. And if anything goes wrong, the taxpayer pays them back. So it's kind of, I mean, I think there's a lot of arguments that there's a lot of goofy stuff that happened in 1913 on. And also what we have now aren't dollars. They're Federal Reserve notes. Right? They're notes that are by the Federal Reserve. And who's the Federal Reserve? Who owns the Federal Reserve? Who owns the corporation, the Federal Reserve? That's secret. Nobody knows. And nobody's ever audited the Federal Reserve. So we don't know how much money is in there. And we don't know who owns it. But we do know that once in a while, like 9 trillion just disappears. And the Inspector General goes, 9 trillion, who knows? And then they get another 9 trillion from the taxpayer. So I admit there's a lot of funny things going on with the federal government, but I'm not sure it goes back to the 14th Amendment. But I don't think this is going to work in court. But, as far as
I know for sure it's not going to work in court.
Yeah, but I've had people come up with this and I'm like, you're gonna have to find someone else, because it's judges aren't going to be like to be told that they don't have jurisdiction. You're in their courtroom and they consider that. And then they also say the lawyers like you and I aren't lawyers because the bar doesn't count. And there may be arguments for that, but I don't think the sovereign what do they call it, sovereign citizens necessarily enunciates it in a clear choice. I mean, I think you're more likely saying, look at the Federal Reserve has never been audited. Right? What's this money thing about? Everybody else can be audited, but you can't audit them. I would say that was something that kind of most normal people would go like, that doesn't make sense. As far as explaining the sovereign thing, I think the 14th Amendment and the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression it's most of the history is how do you say, kind of exaggerated one way to be on the side of the North and the side of the bankers. Sure. Right? And I think the Confederates, who owned like of the total slaves, whatever, say maybe 2% of 2%. So something like 0.004%. And they got blamed for slavery, and they never made any money off it or had any slaves, but they're blamed for slavery. And that's why Sherman marched through and killed all the women and children and burned a swath through Georgia. I mean, what Sherman did to Georgia was pretty nasty. And, they just burned people alive and just mowed them down. And there was no habeas corpus. I mean, they slaughtered. That was atrocity. That was no doubt about that was atrocity. And then, I think the thing Lincoln said, we want to, we don't want to, usually when the London bakers, they lend money to both sides. So they lent money to the North and left money to the South. And it's 100% a year loan shark deal, right? And the winner has to pay the losers, right? That ensures more. Right. So the Rothschilds' cousins lent to North and they lent to the South, like they do for all wars. And when the North won, they wanted the North to squeeze the South even harder. And Lincoln said, no, I don't really want to squeeze them any harder. We already had Sherman down there. And, Lincoln wanted to reunite the country after this.
Right, he did.
And he said, we're going to do is print greenbacks. Right. And we're not going to pay him back in Federal Reserve notes. Well, then he got his brains blown out, which is what happened to Kennedy and what happened to who's the guy? The guy in Libya wanted to do the gold standard. And anybody who doesn't want to use Federal Reserve notes tends to have their brains blown
Issues.
out. And like a suicide thing,
Right.
this happens quite often. But anyway, so there's a lot of things I think that you could attack the Federal Reserve on and the federal authorities, but I don't know if the sovereign citizens is your best argument. I don't know.
Don't think so.
Okay, anyway, we got to sign off. We ran a little over here, and it was great to have you on, Rodney. And
Thank you for having me on.
We'll see you next time, and we'll come up with some new subjects. And if somebody proposes the sovereign immunity, the sovereign citizen defense, I would look at it. I would look at it pretty closely before I
would too.
Okay, good night.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on.
All right.